A single dad stepped in when a girl was being bullied. He didn't know her mother was the reclusive CEO who owned the company he worked for, and his simple act of kindness was about to change both of their lives forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The afternoon sun was weak, casting long, tired shadows across the playground. Liam sat on the edge of a park bench, his worn work boots planted firmly on the ground, a half-read paperback resting on his knee. His daughter, Maya, all of 7 years old with skinned knees and a laugh that could shatter glass, was scaling the jungle gym like it was a mountain she was born to conquer. He watched her with a quiet, bone-deep satisfaction that was the only real currency he dealt in anymore. This was their ritual, their small patch of peace in a world that always seemed to be demanding more than he had to give. The warehouse shifts were long, the paycheck was thin, and the quiet in their small apartment at night was a constant reminder of the person who used to fill it. But here, with the scent of wood chips and the sound of Maya's joyful shouts, he could breathe. He could almost forget the weight. He looked down at his calloused hands, the grease from a morning spent fixing a jammed conveyor belt still stubbornly settled under his nails. He was a man made of practical things, of getting the job done, of showing up. He didn't have much, but what he had, he held with a fierce, unwavering grip. Maya was at the top now, her pigtails catching the wind as she surveyed her kingdom. "Look, Daddy, I'm the queen!" she yelled, and he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and eased the lines of fatigue around them. "I see you, my queen," he called back. It was in that moment of distracted pride that the trouble started. A few older boys, maybe 9 or 10, had cornered another little girl by the swings. She was smaller than them, with dark, serious eyes and a bright pink coat that made her an easy target. Liam's attention shifted, his paternal radar kicking in with a low, familiar hum. One of the boys snatched a small knitted doll from the girl's hands, dangling it just out of her reach. "What's this baby toy?" he taunted, his voice carrying on the wind. The little girl didn't cry. She stood her ground, her small chin lifted, but her hands were clenched into tiny, trembling fists. "Give it back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Make me." The boy shot back, tossing the doll to his friend. Liam's jaw tightened. He watched for a parent, a guardian, anyone. The park was mostly empty, the other adults lost in their phones or conversations. He glanced at Maya, safe on her perch, then back at the girl. He couldn't just sit here. He wasn't built that way. He closed his book, stood up, and started walking toward the swings, his steps steady and unhurried. He didn't plan to yell, didn't plan to make a scene. He just planned to be there, a quiet wall of a man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was stand in the way of a storm. He knew the look on that little girl's face. It was the look of someone trying to be brave when they felt anything but, and he'd be damned if he let her face it alone. The world had taught him that much. Liam approached the scene with a practiced calm, the kind a father develops after years of navigating scraped knees and playground squabbles. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy. The boys, who had been laughing and shoving each other, fell quiet as he got closer. They glanced at his broad shoulders, his work-worn flannel, the steady, unblinking set of his jaw, and the confidence in their small pack began to crumble. He stopped a few feet away, his hands loosely in his pockets, his gaze fixed not on the boys, but on the little girl in the pink coat. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, his voice low and even, not an accusation, but a simple question that demanded an answer. The boy holding the doll stammered, "We were just playing." The little girl looked up at Liam, her dark eyes wide and searching. She didn't speak, but he saw the flicker of relief in her expression. "Doesn't look like she's having much fun," Liam said, his gaze finally shifting to the boys. He held their eyes for a moment, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that was somehow more effective. "I think you have something that belongs to her." The boy hesitated, then reluctantly held out the knitted doll. Liam didn't take it. He nodded toward the girl. "Give it to her." With a huff, The boy tossed the doll at the girl's feet and muttered something under his breath before he and his friends scrambled away, their bravado gone, leaving only the awkward silence behind. Liam knelt, picked up the doll, and brushed the wood chips from its yarn hair. He handed it to the girl, whose small fingers closed around it tightly. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, still not speaking, her eyes fixed on the doll in her hands. "That was brave, what you did," he said, "standing up for yourself like that." A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Chloe!" A woman's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with anxiety. A woman was hurrying across the park, her pace just short of a run. She was dressed in simple jeans and a plain gray coat, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, but she moved with an elegance that seemed out of place. "Oh, thank goodness. I'm so sorry. I just looked away for a second." She knelt beside the girl, Chloe, her hands fluttering over her daughter's shoulders, checking for injuries that weren't there. "Are you hurt? Did they push you?" "I'm okay, Mommy," Chloe whispered, holding up the doll. "He helped me." The woman looked up at Liam, her eyes, the same dark, serious shade as her daughter's, filled with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Thank you," she said, her voice breathless. I don't know what to say." I turned my back for a minute to take a call and... "It's fine," Liam said, standing up. "Kids will be kids." She handled herself well. "Still," the woman said, rising to her feet and reaching into her coat pocket. "Please, let me at least buy you a coffee or something for your trouble." She pulled out a wallet, sleek and black, and her fingers fumbled for a bill. Liam held up a hand, shaking his head. "No, that's not necessary. I'm just glad she's okay." He wasn't being polite, he was being honest. He'd never taken a dime for doing the right thing, and he wasn't about to start now. The woman paused, her hand frozen, and studied him for a moment. It was a look he wasn't used, no pity, not judgment, but a kind of quiet, intense curiosity, as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He just gave a small nod, turned, and walked back toward his own daughter, leaving the woman standing by the swings, a crisp bill still held between her fingers, watching him go with an expression he couldn't read. The woman, who introduced herself as Ellie, watched Liam walk away, her posture still tight, with a residual mix of panic and relief. She tucked her wallet back into her coat, the unspent money feeling strangely heavy in her pocket. She had offered it out of habit, a transactional solution to a problem, the way her world typically operated. His refusal, so simple and absolute, had thrown her off balance. It was clean. There was no negotiation, no expectation. She wasn't used to clean. She knelt again, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "You sure you're okay, sweet pea?" Chloe nodded, her face buried in her mother's coat, the scent of expensive but subtle perfume, a familiar comfort. "The man was nice," Chloe whispered. Ellie stroked her daughter's hair. "Yes, he was." She looked across the park to where Liam was now sitting back on the bench, his daughter Maya climbing into his lap with a triumphant giggle. He was talking to her, his head bent low, his expression soft and unguarded. There was a sturdiness to him, a quiet sense of integrity that emanated from him like warmth from a fire. He was a complete stranger, yet she felt an odd pang of something that felt like envy. Her life was a fortress of scheduled appointments, board meetings, and carefully managed public appearances. Even this trip to the park was a calculated escape, a small window of normalcy squeezed between a conference call and a strategy dinner. She was perpetually surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. She looked at her own hands, manicured and uncalloused, and then at Liam's, which she'd noticed were rough and stained with work. They lived in different universes, that much was clear. But for a moment, watching him with his daughter, she felt like he was the one who was truly wealthy. "Mommy, can we come back here tomorrow?" Chloe asked, pulling away to look up at her. Ellie hesitated. Her schedule was a color-coded grid of obligations, but the hope in her daughter's eyes was a force she found herself unable to resist. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I think we can do that." She stood, taking Chloe's hand, and they started toward the park's exit. She glanced back one last time. Liam was laughing at something Maya had said, his head thrown back. The sound didn't reach her, but the image did. It settled in her mind, a stark and vivid snapshot of a life that felt both impossibly distant and deeply, achingly familiar. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew she wouldn't forget him. He was the first person in a long time who hadn't wanted something from her. He had simply given something, freely and without a price tag, and in her world, that was the rarest commodity of all. She had come to the park seeking a moment of quiet anonymity, and instead, she'd found something far more complicated. The next day, the sky was a crisp, cloudless blue. Liam found himself back at the same park bench, though he told himself it was just a coincidence. It was the bench with the best view of the monkey bars, the one that caught the late afternoon sun just right. Maya was already in motion, a whirlwind of pink sneakers and flying pigtails, her energy a stark contrast to the weariness that had settled deep in Liam's bones. The warehouse had been a beast today. Massive shipment had come in damaged, and he'd spent hours sorting through the wreckage, his muscles aching with the repetitive strain. But he'd promised Maya the park, and a promise to her was sacred. He leaned back, letting the sun warm his face, trying to push the thought of inventory reports and overtime slips out of his mind. He was halfway through a chapter when a small voice piped up beside him. "Hi." He looked down to see Chloe, the little girl from yesterday, standing there with her knitted doll clutched in her hands. She was looking at him with those same serious, watchful eyes. Behind her, her mother, Ellie, stood a few feet away, a hesitant smile on her face. "Looks like we had the same idea," Ellie said, her voice softer than it had been yesterday. She was dressed similarly, in a simple sweater and jeans, a deliberate effort to be unremarkable that somehow only highlighted the quiet elegance she couldn't seem to shake. "It's the best park on this side of town," Liam replied, closing his book. He gestured to the empty space beside him. "Have a seat." She did, perching on the edge of the bench as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to get comfortable. Chloe, meanwhile, had already run off to join Maya by the slide, the two of them falling into the easy, immediate friendship of children. "I wanted to thank you again," Ellie said, her hands clasped in her lap. "Chloe hasn't stopped talking about her park hero." Liam felt a faint flush of embarrassment. "I'm no hero. I'm just a dad." "That's a kind of hero, isn't it?" she countered, her gaze drifting toward the kids. There was a comfortable silence between them for a moment, filled only by the distant sounds of the city and the squeak of the swings. "You live around here?" Liam asked, more to fill the space than anything. She nodded. "For now, I'm in between things, just trying to spend some more time with Chloe." The answer was vague, polished. He could tell it was a practiced line, one that offered little and asked for nothing in return. He knew the type. He didn't press. "I get that," he said instead. "Time's the one thing you can't get back." He told her about his job at the Vance Corporation warehouse, the long hours, the physical toll. He didn't complain. He just stated it as a fact of his life. He found himself talking more than he usually did with strangers, but there was something about her quiet attention that made it easy. She listened, really listened, her dark eyes focused on him, making him feel seen in a way he hadn't in a long time. She, in turn, spoke of her own work in corporate strategy, a term so bland and generic it told him nothing at all. She spoke of the travel, the endless meetings, the pressure to always be on. She didn't mention a company name, and he didn't ask. He didn't care about titles or bottom lines. He cared about the flicker of loneliness he saw in her eyes, the weariness that her perfect posture couldn't quite hide. They were from two different worlds, he knew that. But sitting there, on that sun-warmed bench, they were just two single parents, watching their daughters play and talking about the universal struggle of trying to build a good life in a world that didn't always make it easy. They fell into a routine, unplanned and unspoken. Nearly every afternoon for the next week, they found themselves at the same park. The girls, Maya and Chloe, had become inseparable, a dynamic duo of boundless energy and whispered secrets. Liam and Ellie would sit on their bench, a comfortable distance between them, and talk. Their conversations were never about the big things. They were about the small, essential textures of life. He learned that she loved the smell of old books but never had time to read, that she was a terrible cook, and that she had a fear of heights that she was trying to hide from her daughter. She learned that he could fix anything with a motor, that he drank his coffee black, and that he hummed off-key when he was deep in thought. He told her about his wife, Sarah, not in a flood of grief, but in quiet anecdotes, the way she used to plant sunflowers in their tiny apartment window box, the funny sound she made when she laughed too hard. It was the first time he'd spoken of her to a stranger without feeling like he was opening a wound. With Ellie, it felt like sharing a map of where he'd been. She, in turn, spoke of a past that was just as shadowed, though for different reasons. She mentioned a difficult divorce, a partner who had valued image over integrity, and the profound loneliness of being in a crowded room. Her words were always careful, edited, but Liam could read between the lines. He saw a woman who had been let down, who had learned to build walls to protect what was left of her heart. One afternoon, as a cool breeze rustled the leaves, Liam noticed Chloe's favorite doll was starting to come apart. One of its button eyes was dangling by a thread. "Oh no," Ellie sighed, looking at it with a helpless expression. "I have no idea how to fix that." "I do," Liam said. He pulled a small multi-tool from his Pokita habit he'd never broken, and with the tiny pliers, he carefully rethreaded the button, cinching it tight. He worked with a gentle precision, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft. Chloe watched, fascinated, as he performed the minor surgery. When he was done, he handed the doll back, its eye now secure. "There you go," he said. "Good as new." Ellie stared at him, then at the doll, and a genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face. "Is there anything you can't fix?" she asked, a hint of awe in her voice. "Plenty," he said, tucking the tool away. "But the small things, the important things, I try to show up for those." She held his gaze for a long moment, the park fading into a soft blur around them. In that simple act of mending a broken toy, he had shown her a kind of care she hadn't realized she was starving for. It wasn't grand or expensive, it was just real. And for Eleanor Vance, a woman who lived in a world of manufactured perfection, real was becoming the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The line between their two worlds was beginning to blur, and neither of them seemed to want to draw it again. The park bench became their sanctuary, a neutral ground where the labels of their outside lives didn't seem to matter. He was just Liam, a father who could fix anything, and she was just Ellie, a mother with sad eyes and a quiet laugh. The ease between them grew with each passing day, a fragile vine wrapping around the sturdy trunk of their shared parental experience. He started bringing an extra coffee in a thermos, black, just the way she'd mentioned she liked it, though she was used to barista-made concoctions with names longer than the ingredients list. She started bringing snacks for the girls, small bags of sliced apples or homemade cookies that were slightly burnt around the edges, a testament to her self-proclaimed lack of culinary skill. Liam found them endearing. He found himself looking forward to these afternoons more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. They were a break in the gray monotony of his life, a splash of color he hadn't realized was missing. He liked the way she listened, the way her brow furrowed in concentration when he explained the complex logistics of the warehouse. She didn't feign interest. She seemed genuinely fascinated by a world so different from her own. He never mentioned the name of the company he worked for again. It was just the warehouse, a place of concrete and steel, a world away from the soft grass of the park. For her part, Eleanor found herself shedding the layers of her corporate armor. With Liam, she didn't have to be on. She didn't have to anticipate the angle, the ask, the subtle power play hidden beneath a polite smile. He wanted nothing from her. His presence was a gift, not a transaction. She told him about the pressures of her job, the constant demand for growth, the soullessness of chasing metrics. She painted a picture of a life that was successful by every external measure but felt hollow on the inside. "Sometimes I feel like I'm the loneliest person in a room of 1,000 people," she admitted one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper. Liam didn't offer a platitude. He just nodded, his gaze steady. "I know that feeling," he said. "After Sarah died, the house was full of people for weeks. Never felt more alone in my life." In that shared admission, a new level of intimacy was forged. They weren't just two parents anymore. They were two lonely souls who had found a flicker of recognition in the other's eyes. The unspoken attraction that had hummed beneath the surface of their conversations grew stronger, a magnetic pull they were both trying to ignore. But it was there, in the way their hands brushed when he passed her a coffee, in the way their gazes lingered a second too long, in the quiet understanding that this was becoming more than just a series of convenient meetings at a playground. It was becoming a lifeline. And they were both starting to hold on a little too tight. The warehouse was a symphony of controlled chaos. Forklifts beeped their rhythmic warnings, conveyor belts hummed a monotonous tune, and the thud of boxes being loaded and unloaded provided the percussion. Liam moved through it all with an innate understanding of its flow, a conductor who knew every instrument by heart. He was a foreman, a small but essential cog in the massive machine that was Vance Corporation Global Logistics. He'd worked there for 10 years, climbing slowly from a temp on the loading dock to a position of modest authority. It was a good job, a steady job. It paid the bills, mostly. He didn't think much about the name on the building, Vance. It was just a name, a distant, faceless entity that signed his paychecks. The CEO, Eleanor Vance, was even more of an abstraction, a figure he'd only seen in a heavily filtered corporate photo in the breakroom newsletter years ago. She was a legend, a ghost, the woman who had inherited the empire and tripled its value. No one on the floor had ever seen her. The rumors said she lived in a different city, a different world entirely. This week, however, a new kind of buzz filled the warehouse. A company-wide Vision Forward initiative was being rolled out. New posters were plastered on the walls, glossy and corporate blue, featuring abstract graphics and motivational slogans. The centerpiece of the campaign was a video message from the CEO herself, to be played at the start of every shift for the entire week. Liam gathered his team in the break room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and tired cynicism. He hit play on the monitor, and the screen lit up. A sleek, minimalist office appeared, with a sprawling city view behind a wall of glass. And then she walked into the frame. Liam's heart stopped. It was Ellie. Not Ellie from the park with the messy bun and the sad, gentle eyes. This was Eleanor Vance. Her hair was styled in a severe, elegant sweep. She wore a tailored blazer the color of steel. Her voice, when she spoke, was the one he knew, but it was different, polished, confident, commanding. She spoke of quarterly growth, supply chain optimization, and market synergy. The words were familiar corporate jargon, but coming from her mouth, they sounded alien. The man next to Liam whistled under his breath. "Wow, never thought I'd actually see her. She's intense." Liam didn't respond. He couldn't. He stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping up his spine. The woman on the screen, the powerful, untouchable CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, was the same woman who had laughed at his dumb jokes, who had confessed her loneliness on a park bench, who had let him fix her daughter's doll with his dirty, calloused hands. She had sat beside him and listened to him talk about his life, his job at her company, and she had never said a word. The video ended. The room was quiet for a beat, then erupted in the usual grumbling about corporate nonsense. But Liam didn't hear it. He felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. It wasn't just that she was wealthy or powerful, it was the lie, the quiet, deliberate omission that now reframed every moment they had shared. He wasn't a friend, he was a curiosity, an experiment, a little slice of the real world for the bored billionaire. The warmth he'd felt, the connection he'd thought was real, it all curdled into a bitter mix of humiliation and betrayal. He walked out of the break room, the CEO's perfectly articulated words about synergy and our corporate family ringing in his ears like a mocking laugh. The world had tilted on its axis. The park, once a refuge, now felt like a stage. The bench, once a shared sanctuary, was now a monument to his own foolishness. Liam didn't go back the next day or the day after. He told Maya he had to work late, an excuse she accepted with a disappointed sigh. He couldn't face Eleanor. He couldn't look at her without seeing the lie shimmering between them. He felt like a fool. He, who prided himself on being able to read situations, on seeing things for what they were, had been completely blind. Every shared vulnerability, every quiet confession, was now tainted. Had she been laughing at him internally when he complained about the warehouse logistics, knowing she could fire his entire department with a single email? Was he just a story she would tell at a cocktail party, the quaint little working-class man she'd met? The thought made his stomach churn. His phone buzzed on the third day. Her name, Ellie, flashed on the screen. He stared at it, his thumb hovering over the green icon. He wanted to answer, to demand an explanation, but what was the point? The power imbalance was a chasm too wide to shout across. He let it go to voicemail. She called again an hour later. He ignored it again. The silence felt safer. On Friday, he took Maya to a different park, one across town. It was smaller, the equipment older, but it was blessedly empty. As Maya played, he sat on a cold metal bench, the thermos of coffee he'd instinctively brought for two growing cold beside him. He felt a presence before he saw her. He looked up, and there she was, standing at the edge of the playground. Eleanor. She must have been looking for him. She looked different today, more like the woman on the video. Her hair was neater, her coat more structured. The effortless Ellie was gone, replaced by someone who looked like she was preparing for a confrontation. She walked toward him, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. "Liam," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk." "I don't think we have anything to talk about, Miss Suze." "Vance," he said, the name feeling foreign and sharp on his tongue. Her face flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. "Please don't call me that." "Why not?" "It's your name, isn't it? The one on the building where I work. The one that signs my paychecks." The bitterness he'd been swallowing for days finally spilled out. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice losing some of its composure. "When exactly is the right time to say, 'By the way, I'm your boss's boss's boss, and I own the air you breathe at work'? Maybe before you let me talk about how much I hate the new inventory system you personally approved," he shot back, his voice rising despite his efforts to keep it level. "Liam, it wasn't like that." "What was it like then? Was I a project? A little field trip to see how the other half lives?" "No," she said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't that at all. You were. You were the first real person I'd talked to in years. I didn't want to ruin it." "Well, you did," he said, the words landing with a cold finality. He stood up, his posture rigid. "I have to protect my daughter. I have to protect my job. I can't be." Whatever this was. He looked at her, at the powerful, beautiful, complicated woman who had made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, and all he could see now was risk. "We're from different worlds, Eleanor. It was stupid of me to think we weren't. Please, just stay in yours. I'll stay in mine." He called for Maya, his voice rough, and walked away without looking back, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the empty park, the chasm between them now, a gaping, unbridgeable canyon. The days that followed were shades of gray. Liam threw himself into his work, a refuge of physical exhaustion that left little room for thought. He was the first to arrive at the warehouse, and the last to leave, his movements sharp, efficient, and devoid of their usual steady calm. His crew noticed the change. The easy banter died down, the shared jokes fell flat. Liam was there, but he wasn't present. He was a shell, his mind perpetually elsewhere, replaying conversations on a park bench, dissecting every word for hidden meanings, for signs he should have seen. The anger had faded, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache of disappointment. It wasn't just the lie, it was the loss of the feeling he'd had with her. That feeling of being seen, of being understood. He had allowed a small flicker of hope into the carefully guarded fortress of his life, and now that it was gone, the silence it left behind was deafening. Maya felt the shift too. She was quieter at home, her usual boisterous energy replaced by a more subdued watchfulness. "Is Ellie mad at us, Daddy?" she asked one evening, pushing her green beans around her plate. Liam's hand stilled, his fork hovering over his own meal. "No, sweetie, she's not mad. She's just busy." "Oh," Maya said, her small brow furrowed. "Grown-ups are busy a lot." The simple, innocent observation struck Liam harder than any accusation could have. He was being a grown-up. He was being practical, logical, safe. He was protecting them. So why did it feel so much like he was letting them down? Meanwhile, in a glass-walled office overlooking the city, Eleanor Vance was drowning in the very life she had tried to escape. The meetings were endless, the decisions monumental, the pressure suffocating. She moved through her days with a flawless, automated precision, her face a mask of cool competence. But inside, she was unraveling. The park, the bench, the taste of slightly burnt cookie-sit all felt like a dream she'd woken up from too soon. Liam's face, his quiet strength, his calloused hands fixing a child's toy, these images were seared into her mind. His words echoed in her head. "Stay in your world, I'll stay in mine." She had tried. She had thrown herself back into the world of numbers and stock prices, the world where she was Eleanor Vance, CEO. But the armor no longer fit. It felt hollow, brittle. She found herself staring out her window, not at the sprawling cityscape, but past it, searching for a patch of green she knew she couldn't see. She had hurt him. That was the fact she couldn't escape. In her attempt to feel real, she had been careless with someone else's reality. She had confirmed his worst assumptions about people like her. She sat at her massive desk, a stack of contracts waiting for her signature, and felt a profound, gut-wrenching loneliness. She had everything she was supposed to want, and it all felt like nothing. The one thing that had felt real, the one person who had seen past the name and the money, was gone, and it was her fault. She had built a fortress around her heart for years, and the one time she had lowered the drawbridge, she had ended up hurting the only person she had wanted to let in. Life settled into a new, uncomfortable normal. For Liam, it meant a constant, low-grade vigilance. He was hyper-aware of his position at the warehouse, second-guessing every decision, bracing for a pink slip that never came. He avoided the main office, kept his head down, and spoke only when necessary. He was a model employee, efficient and invisible, which was exactly how he thought a man in his position should behave when the CEO knew his name. The quiet ache for what he'd lost was a constant companion, a ghost that sat beside him on the park bench he now studiously avoided. He told himself it was for the best, a necessary amputation to prevent a greater infection of hope and inevitable heartbreak. He had Maya. That was enough. It had to be. For Eleanor, her return to the throne felt like a self-imposed prison sentence. She chaired meetings with a detached authority, her mind drifting to the memory of a child's laughter and the feeling of a man's steady gaze. The corporate world, once her battlefield and her victory, now felt like a gilded cage. The Vision Forward campaign she had launched felt like a bitter irony. What vision did she have, other than a life she couldn't return to? Her executives noticed the change. Her legendary focus was gone, replaced by a distracted, melancholic air. They attributed it to the stress of leadership, never guessing its true source was a warehouse foreman who had rejected her. The catalyst for change came, as it often did, from the innocent wisdom of a child. One Saturday, as Liam was trying to fix a leaky faucet in their small apartment bathroom, Maya sat on the floor, coloring. She had been quiet all morning. "Daddy," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "Yeah, sweetie? Do you miss Ellie?" The question was so direct, so simple, it disarmed him completely. He fumbled with his wrench, the metal clattering against the porcelain sink. He cleared his throat. It's complicated, Maya." "No, it's not," she said, finally looking up at him, her crayon poised in her hand. "You were happier when she was here, you laughed more." He stopped what he was doing and looked at his daughter. Her expression was not accusatory, just observant. It was a simple statement of fact, and it was true. He had been happier. He had felt lighter, more alive. "Sometimes," she continued, turning back to her paper, "you have to be brave for the happy stuff too. not just the hard stuff. Liam sank down onto the edge of the bathtub, the wrench forgotten in his hand. A 7-year-old had just diagnosed the core of his cowardice with devastating accuracy. He had been brave his whole life for the hard things, for Sarah's illness, for raising a daughter alone, for the relentless grind of his job. But he hadn't been brave enough for the possibility of happiness. He had let fear of what he could lose prevent him from fighting for what he could gain. He had seen Eleanor not as a person, but as a symbol of a world that could hurt him. He had put her in a box, just as he'd accused her of doing to him. He looked at his hands, calloused and capable. They could fix engines, conveyor belts, leaky faucets. Maybe, just maybe, they could fix this too. He stood up, a new resolve hardening in his chest. He didn't know if it was too late, but for the first time in weeks, he knew he had to try. He had to be brave for the happy stuff. For Maya, and for himself. Liam didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't let it end like this, with silence and misunderstanding. The thought of walking into the gleaming, monolithic headquarters of Vance Corporation was intimidating enough to make his stomach clench, but the thought of never seeing Ellie again was worse. He started small. He found a piece of sturdy cardboard from a packing box at the warehouse and, during his lunch break, carefully sketched the park bench on it. It was a simple, rough drawing, but it was honest. He drew 2 stick figures sitting on it and 2 smaller ones playing by the swings. He didn't write a note. The image, he hoped, would say enough. He addressed the plain manila envelope to Eleanor Vance, CEO, feeling a fresh wave of absurdity as he wrote the words. He left the return address blank. He dropped it in a mailbox on his way home from work, the act feeling both monumental and hopelessly small. What was a cardboard drawing to a woman who dealt in billions? The envelope landed on Eleanor's desk 3 days later, sorted by her assistant from a mountain of corporate mail. It was out of place, a piece of humble brown cardboard amidst glossy reports and embossed letterheads. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara, had almost thrown it out, but something about the lack of a return address made her pause. She placed it on top of the pile. Eleanor saw it as soon as she walked into her office. She picked it up, her brow furrowed. When she slid the drawing out, her breath caught. It was the bench. It was them. There were no words, but the message was as clear as a bell. It wasn't an apology, it was a memory, a reminder of what was real. It was an olive branch, offered from a world away. She sank into her leather chair, the drawing held in both hands, and for the first time since she'd returned, she felt a flicker of the woman she'd been at that park. The woman who laughed at bad jokes and wasn't afraid of burnt cookies. Liam hadn't given up. He had reached across the chasm. Now it was her turn. She buzzed her assistant. "Clara, cancel my afternoon. All of it." "But Miss Vance, you have the quarterly review with the board." "Cancel it," Eleanor repeated, her voice firm, clear. She stood up, the drawing still in her hand. She was done letting her schedule dictate her life. She grabbed her coat, the simple gray one she'd worn to the park, and walked out of her office without a backward glance. She didn't know what she would say to him, but she knew where she had to go. She was going back to the bench. It was the only place that had ever felt like true north. The park was quiet, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of a late afternoon. The air was cool, carrying the first hints of autumn. Eleanor sat on the bench, their bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been waiting for nearly an hour, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach with each passing minute. What if he didn't come? What if the drawing was a farewell, not an invitation? She watched the families come and go, the laughter of children echoing around her, and felt a profound sense of being an outsider again. Then she saw him. He was walking up the path, his stride steady, his shoulders set. He wore the same worn flannel jacket. He wasn't looking at her, but at his daughter, Maya, who was walking beside him, holding his hand. Her heart leaped into her throat. He stopped a few feet away. Maya, however, did not. She let go of her father's hand and ran toward her. "Ellie!" she cried, throwing her arms around Eleanor's legs in an unreserved hug. Eleanor's eyes stung as she wrapped her own arms around the little girl. "Hey, sweetie, I missed you." "We missed you too," Maya said, pulling back to look at her seriously. "Daddy was sad." Liam flinched, but didn't deny it. He walked the rest of the way and stood before them, his hands in his pockets, his expression a mixture of hope and trepidation. "I got your drawing," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "It wasn't a drawing," he corrected gently. "It was a question." She stood up, her gaze locked with his. The space between them crackled with unspoken words, with weeks of silence and regret. "And what's the answer?" he asked, his voice low. "The answer is, I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was a coward. I hid who I was because I was afraid you wouldn't see past the name, the money. I was so afraid of you judging me that I never gave you a chance not to. I was a coward too," he admitted, his own voice thick with emotion. "I saw the name, the power, and I ran. I let my fear of your world blind me to the person who was standing right in front of me. I'm the one who's sorry." Maya looked between them, a small, knowing smile on her face. "See? You're not mad at each other." They both looked down at the little girl, then back at each other, and a slow, shared smile broke through the tension. "No," Eleanor said, her eyes shining. "We're not mad. I don't know how we make this work," Liam said honestly. "Our lives, they're not built the same." "Then we build something new," she replied, taking a hesitant step closer. Together. She reached out and took his hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers. A perfect, unexpected fit. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning. A real, complicated, terrifying, and beautiful beginning. And as the sun set over the park, casting them in a warm, golden light, they stood there, holding hands, two different worlds finally choosing to become one. The first step was the hardest. It required a level of vulnerability that neither of them was used to. For Liam, it meant letting her into his world, the real one, not just the curated piece of the park. He invited her to his apartment for dinner. It was a small two-bedroom place in a building where the paint was peeling and the hallways always smelled faintly of other people's cooking. He spent the entire day cleaning, scrubbing floors, and worrying that it wouldn't be enough. When she arrived, she wasn't wearing a blazer or heels. She was in a soft sweater, carrying a bag of groceries with a nervous smile. She didn't comment on the size of the apartment or the worn-out couch. Instead, her eyes went straight to the wall of Maya's drawings, taped up by the kitchen. "This is my favorite part," she said, tracing a picture of a lopsided, smiling sun. He cooked spaghetti, the only meal he knew how to make that wasn't from a box. She helped, chopping vegetables with a surprising lack of skill that made him laugh. They ate at his small, wobbly kitchen table, with Maya chattering happily between them. It was simple, imperfect, and one of the best meals Eleanor had ever had. For Eleanor, her first step was letting him into her world. Not the corporate fortress, but the personal one. She took him and Maya to her home, a sprawling, modern house in a gated community that felt more like a museum than a place where people lived. The silence in the house was immense, the rooms vast and empty. Liam walked through it with a quiet awe, but also a dawning understanding of her loneliness. "It's big," he said, standing in the center of a living room that could have fit his entire apartment. "It's empty," she replied, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. Maya, however, was in heaven. She discovered the indoor swimming pool and the home theater, her squeals of delight bringing a life to the house it had never known. While Maya watched a movie, they sat on the patio overlooking a perfectly manicured lawn, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I sold the place," Eleanor said suddenly. Liam looked at her, surprised. "What?" "This house, it's not a home. It's a monument to a life I don't want anymore. I'm looking for something smaller, something with walls that have heard laughter." He didn't know what to say. The gesture was so profound, so decisive, it left him speechless. He saw then that she wasn't just talking about building something new, she was actively tearing down the old. She was meeting him more than halfway. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "You're not just some CEO, you're a force of nature." She smiled, a real, radiant smile. "I'm just a woman who finally figured out what's important." They were still from different worlds, but they were learning to build bridges. They were learning each other's languages, navigating the foreign territories of their lives with a careful, growing trust. The chasm between them was still there, but it no longer looked unbridgeable. It looked like a space they could fill, together. The change at Vance Corporation began subtly. It wasn't a press release or a dramatic overhaul, but a series of small, significant shifts that started from the top down. Eleanor began walking the floors of her buildings, including the warehouses. Her first visit to Liam's facility sent a ripple of shock through the workforce. The CEO, the ghost in the machine, was there, in person, wearing safety boots and a simple coat. She didn't come with an entourage of executives. She came alone. She asked Liam to give her a tour. He walked her through the aisles, explaining the choke points in the workflow, the outdated equipment, the strain on the workers. He spoke plainly, honestly, not as an employee to a boss, but as an expert in his field. She listened, not with the detached air of a strategist, but with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. She asked questions. She spoke to the other workers, remembering their names, listening to their complaints and their ideas. Following her visit, things started to change. New, ergonomic equipment began to arrive. The company announced a new profit-sharing initiative for all non-executive employees. They expanded parental leave policies and invested in on-site childcare resources. The Vision Forward campaign was quietly replaced with a new slogan, "People First." The corporate world was stunned, the board was skeptical, but the workers on the floor, the men and women who, like Liam, were the engine of the company, felt the change in a real, tangible way. They felt seen. Liam's crew started looking at him differently, with a new level of respect. He wasn't just their foreman, he was the man who had the CEO's ear. But Liam and Eleanor kept their personal relationship quiet. It was theirs. It wasn't for public consumption. They continued their life outside the warehouse walls, a blended family in the making. They went to farmers' markets and cooked lopsided pancakes on Saturday mornings. He taught her how to change a tire. She taught him about art he'd never heard of. Their worlds were still different, but they no longer felt separate. They were two parts of a whole, each bringing their own strengths, their own histories. One evening, as they sat on the familiar park bench, watching Maya and Chloe chase fireflies, Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think power was about control, about being at the top." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "And now?" "Now," she said, her gaze on their daughters, "I think real power is about building a world where everyone feels safe enough to be happy." Liam looked at the two little girls, their laughter a melody in the twilight, and then at the incredible woman beside him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she was right. They had found their power, not in a boardroom or a warehouse, but right here, on a simple park bench, in the quiet, revolutionary act of choosing each other. The life they were building wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. The sunlight streamed through the large windows of the newly opened community center, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The building, a once derelict library on the edge of town, had been transformed. Fresh paint, bright murals, and shelves stocked with new books and computers gave it an air of vibrant hope. This was Eleanor's first major project under her new People First initiative, a community hub funded entirely by Vance Corp, offering after-school programs, job training, and free childcare. At the opening ceremony, Eleanor stood at a simple wooden podium, not in a power suit, but in a simple dress, her hair pulled back loosely. She spoke not of corporate responsibility or brand synergy, but of community, of the importance of investing in people. Liam stood in the back of the crowd, Maya perched on his shoulders, watching with a quiet pride that felt boundless. He wasn't just watching his partner, he was watching the physical manifestation of the values they shared. He saw the faces in the crowd, his neighbors, his co-workers, people from all walks of life, and saw the genuine hope in their eyes. This wasn't charity, it was change. After her speech, Eleanor made her way through the crowd, not with the distance of a CEO, but with the warmth of a neighbor. She stopped when she reached Liam, her eyes lighting up. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice low, meant only for him. "I think," he said, lifting Maya off his shoulders, "that you're just getting started." Maya immediately ran over to Chloe, who was helping hand out cupcakes, and the two dissolved into a fit of giggles. Eleanor watched them, her heart full. "I have a board meeting tomorrow," she said, turning back to Liam. "They're resistant to some of my bigger ideas. They think I'm being too idealistic, that I'm forgetting the bottom line." Liam took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Then show them this," he said, gesturing to the bustling room, to the children reading in a brightly lit corner, to the adults signing up for computer classes. "This is the bottom line. It's not about what a company makes, it's about what it builds." His simple, unwavering belief in her was the only armor she needed. She squeezed his hand, her confidence restored. "I want you to come with me," she said. "To the meeting." He raised an eyebrow. "Me? In a boardroom? I don't think I own a tie." "You don't need a tie," she said, her smile soft but firm. "I just need you. You're my true north, Liam. You remind me what we're fighting for." He looked into her eyes and saw not a billionaire CEO, but the woman he loved, a woman who was trying to change the world, one community center, one person at a time. And he knew he would follow her anywhere. The boardroom was an arena of silent power. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the cold, recessed lighting from above. The chairs were black leather, high-backed and imposing. Seated around the table were the titans of industry, men and one other woman in severe, dark suits, their faces impassive masks of wealth and influence. They exuded an aura of untouchable authority. When Eleanor walked in, a murmur went through the room. But when Liam followed a step behind her, the murmur died into a stunned, palpable silence. He wore his best pair of dark work pants and a clean, pressed button-down shirt, no tie. His hands, calloused and sure, were at his sides. He was not one of them, and every person in that room knew it. He felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. For a fleeting moment, he felt the urge to shrink, to apologize for his presence. But then he met Eleanor's gaze, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all he needed. He straightened his shoulders and stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence. "Good morning," Eleanor began, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension. "Before we begin with the quarterly reports, I'd like to introduce Liam." She didn't give his last name, didn't mention his job title. "He is my partner, and he is the inspiration for the new direction this company is taking." An older man with silver hair, the board's chairman, cleared his throat. "Eleanor, with all due respect, this is highly unorthodox. This is a board meeting, not a social gathering." "I'm aware of that, Charles," she said, her tone unwavering. "For too long, the decisions made in this room have been disconnected from the people they affect. We talk about manpower, about units and logistics, but we forget we're talking about human beings. We've been looking at the world from 50 floors up. Liam has been looking at it from the ground. I believe we need his perspective." She then launched into her proposal, not with charts and graphs, but with stories. She told them about the community center, about the single mothers who could now seek employment because of the free childcare, about the teenagers learning skills that would give them a future. Liam didn't say a word, he just stood there. But his presence spoke volumes. He was the living embodiment of her new philosophy. He was the people in her People First initiative. When she finished, the room was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. It was the sound of a long-held paradigm beginning to crack. Charles, the chairman, looked from Eleanor to Liam, then back again. He picked up his pen, tapped it once on the table, and then gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Very well, Eleanor," he said. "Let's hear more." In that moment, Liam understood. He wasn't an intruder in her world. He was a necessary part of it. And together they were building a bridge, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt like they were on the wrong side of the divide. The seasons turned. Autumn's crisp air softened into the quiet chill of winter, and then melted into the tentative warmth of spring. The world Liam and Eleanor built together was not a whirlwind romance for the tabloids, but a quiet, sturdy structure forged in the everyday. It was in the way he'd show up at her office at the end of a long day, not with flowers, but with a thermos of coffee, knowing she'd be too drained to make it herself. It was in the way she'd sit in the messy, loud garage of his apartment building, reading a book while he taught Maya how to properly change the oil in his old car, her presence a calm anchor in his world of grease and gears. They were an odd, beautiful sight, the CEO in her cashmere sweater learning the difference between a socket and a wrench, and the warehouse foreman who could hold his own in a debate about fiscal responsibility with a board of directors. The company continued to transform under their shared vision. Productivity at the warehouses increased, not because of pressure, but because of morale. The People First Fund grew, sponsoring scholarships and community health clinics. Eleanor Vance, once known as a ruthless corporate shark, was now being hailed as a visionary, a leader who understood that a company's greatest asset was its humanity. But their true success was measured in smaller, quieter moments. It was measured in the easy laughter that now filled Eleanor's new, smaller house. It was in the way Maya and Chloe had become true sisters, navigating the world as a united front. It was measured in the comfort of a shared silence on their park bench, watching the sunset, their hands intertwined, two once separate worlds now so completely merged they couldn't imagine them apart. One Saturday afternoon, they were all at the park, the place where it all began. Maya and Chloe were on the swings, trying to see who could go higher, their shouts of joy a familiar soundtrack. Liam and Eleanor sat on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. He was reading a newspaper, and she was sketching in a small notebook, a hobby she'd picked up again. "You know," Liam said, folding the paper and setting it aside, "I saw an article about you in here." She looked up, a playful smile on her lips. "Oh, what am I being accused of this week? Tanking the stock market with kindness?" "Something like that," he chuckled. "It called you the unlikeliest revolutionary." She tilted her head, considering the title. "I'll take it, but they got one thing wrong." "What's that?" "I'm not the revolutionary," she said, her gaze soft as it rested on him. "I just fell in love with one." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, easy kiss full of the comfort and certainty of a love that had been tested and had not only survived but had thrived. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was something far better. It was their life, built not on fantasy, but on the solid, unshakable ground of kindness, respect, and a love that was brave enough to see past the surface to the real, important things underneath.